Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. Thank you so much for being here with us today for this International Migrations Framework capacity building session, which is part of the Youth in the Move program as well. Let me just, apologies, I'm letting people in and we're about to start. Great. So thank you so much for being here today. This is a little bit of an overview of our agenda of what we're going to be doing. So I'm just going to walk you through some quick welcome and check-in, and then I'm going to hand it over to Francesca, who's going to be running the session on the international migration frameworks. And then we're going to have some time for Q&A and then some closing and next steps. So here are a few housekeeping rules. So please do keep your camera on if possible. We would love to see you, but of course we understand if you're in a space that doesn't allow so, or if your internet connection is not that great. So it's no problem. It would be great if you can write your name and your pronouns in your description, such as you can see in the example, so we know how to properly address you. And we kindly ask you to keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking as well. Please do use the raise hand feature to ask questions or contribute, but we kindly ask that all questions be asked at the end. And then please be courteous to all participants and speakers as well. And if you have any technical problems, please feel free to message me, Stephanie Livieri at my CV privately, and I'll try my best to help you. So thank you so much for following those guidelines. And then, well, actually, apologies. I think I'm just going to quickly come here. So it's a bit easier for people. So we have live French translation for this session introduction. So you just need to click on the globe interpretation. You should see it at the bottom of your screen. If you don't, there should be 3 dots and then you're going to see it. And then you can choose your language of preference. So if you speak French or if you prefer French, please do select French. Otherwise, please do select the English channel. So that would be great. And with that, I'll quickly come back. So we would love for everyone to introduce yourself through the chat. So please do let us know. And I saw that some people already started. Thank you for that. Let us know your name or the country you're from or where you're based currently. And do reply to the question below. That would be lovely. So what's the song that you've been listening on repeat lately? So if you have anything that you can get off your mind, please do let us know. And then as a quick overview of the Youth in the Move capacity building sessions, they are running throughout the year. This is the 4th session that is happening. And based on feedback, we've slightly adapted the format and the frequency. So today, as I mentioned, we have live French interpretation available. And these sessions are aimed at building youth capacity on several topics related to migration and displacement. Something really important. So please note that we're going to send out an attendance form. Apologies, that's not 2, that's just 1. Towards the end of the session today. So if you're interested in receiving an attendance certificate, please make sure to add your name to it. I'm going to send it over on the chat. It's going to be in English and in French, and you're going to have 15 minutes to just sign in. So those who attend 2 out of the remaining 3 sessions will be able to receive a certificate from on our end. And I think with this translation, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So Francesca is a multilingual junior researcher and aspiring migration policy expert. And she brings experiences from the Philippines, Poland, and France to offer a cross-regional, intersectional, and holistic perspective on the analysis of contemporary migration issues. So currently, she's a postgraduate student in migration studies at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and then EHESS. Previously, she served as a research and editorial assistant at the Scalabrini Migration Center and the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, the SAGE UK, and as a research assistant at the University of Warsaw on international labor migration. So in parallel, Francesca is passionate about promoting meaningful youth engagement in policy spaces on migration, and she's one of 4 global focal points at the Migration, Youth and Children platform. and leads the organization's official mandate in facilitating youth participation at the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the GFMD. So she has superheaded national youth consultations in the Global Compact for Migration Process and previously served as an Asian Pacific regional focal point for MYCP. So without any further ado, Francesca, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone joining today. Super happy to see that the chat box is very active right now and seeing all of your your little earworms. I'm super excited about that. All right, let's begin with today's presentation on International Migration Frameworks 101. And after that, we're also going to taper it down to the role of youth in global migration governance. So just quickly, next slide, please. Here is an outline of what I will be discussing. First, in order to fully understand the different international migration frameworks, we're going to introduce global migration governance. We have to situate these frameworks because we know that they do not function in a vacuum, in order to understand how they work. Second, we will talk about two key international migration frameworks. They are not the only one, and that is very important to note. However, they have been selected because they are the two main ones in which MyCP has a mandate, as well as they are two of the most relevant ones, I would say, in today's time. For part three, we will look at the role of youth in the two international migration frameworks that will be discussed and what the Migration Youth and Children Platform, for those who are not familiar with our work, does in order to facilitate the role of young people in these processes. Lastly, this I will leave to you. There's a short review at the end, as well as any onward resources for those who would like to do some further reading. All right. So, beginning with an introduction to global migration governance, I like to make this as interactive as possible. So, in the chat, I'm going to ask you, as much as you want, what comes to mind when you hear the term global migration governance? I want you to think not only in terms of frameworks, but also in terms of actors. Who do you think of when you hear global migration governance? Who are involved on the producing end? Who are involved on the receiving end of it? As well as spaces. What spaces are relevant? What are the places that come into mind when we talk about global migration governance? Feel free to just chime in the chat. I see already someone has mentioned UNHCR. Um, Very good for actors, right? Any other spaces, frameworks, actors that come to mind? And also importance, the so what? Why do we need global migration governance? Why are we even in this capacity building session today in the first place? I see another actor, UNICEF. So I think UN agencies, right? UNHCR, UNICEF, these are UN agencies. These are international organizations. We have the IOM, another UN agency, the UN Migration Agency. You have the Nansen Initiative, very good. Someone here knows the history of the United Nations. I like it. And then importance for the protection of migrants and refugees. So importance, but also actors, rights-based programs. Very good. So something that is rights-based as a framework. I'll give it one more minute to chime in on what you think of when you hear global migration governance. Any terms that come into mind, any actors, spaces, and frameworks? What about spaces, actually? I don't see anyone chiming in on spaces. What are the spaces that are relevant? National implementation spaces, states. Very good. So, an actor and a space where it's relevant. Refugee conventions, immigration, GCM, labor. Awesome. So, all of this, we're going to try to situate into a broader concept, which is global migration governance. So, next slide, please. Here we go. Let's kind of push it further and ask you guys, why do we call it global migration governance in the first place in order to understand what it means? So, first question, if anyone wants to unmute, please raise your hand and I will call you. Why don't we just call it international migration governance? Why do we call it global migration governance? Is there a difference between the two? Does anybody want to guess or does anybody know the response here? I'll let that kind of simmer for a few seconds before I move on. Yes, Zainab. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Please unmute.
No, it was perfect. I hope you can hear me. My theory would be international is more so between governments, and global includes more actors.
Very good. It's your theory is definitely rooted in the reality. I also see here Swarali in the chat said, does it involve internal migration? To some extent, yes. International is used to distinguish from usually national, so something that is states that involves states. And global, on the other hand, tries to really push for what is the multilateral world order, right? So, what involves actors that even go beyond just the international level. So different states interacting with each other to involve a variety of actors, not only international organizations, but also different stakeholders. We have, for instance, within the UN system, the MGOS, also known as the major groups and other stakeholders. Within the GFMD, we will see later, we have the different mechanisms and the youth. And so that includes civil society, businesses, mayors, etc. What about governance? Why do we call it global migration governance? How is it different from governments? If anyone wants to chime in again, why do we say we need to govern global migration? Anyone wants to try? In the chat is also fine. Fatuma, please.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
So I think we call it international migration governance because it has rules, a system of rules, and also policies.
Amazing. Thank you. So yes, we do call it global migration governance and not governments because there are some tools that are involved, instruments, and we will be discussing that soon. Another reason we distinguish, right, is because if we look at the four, some people say five components of states, we have the population, we have sovereignty, we have territory, and we also have the government, right? Um, and then some people say it's five. It also includes recognition from other states. But the government here is just a constitutive of states. Governance is how to do that, how to bring it into action through a set of tools, through a set of frameworks, and through the people, the leaders that are a part of it. And lastly, really should be a no-brainer, but what constitutes migration and who is considered a migrant? Now, I currently major in migration studies, and I find it very, very difficult to explain such a super simple concept, right? What is migration and who is considered a migrant? So, can anybody guess in the chat, or maybe someone knows, how many months does it take for you to move from your usual place of residence to another, um, in order to be considered a migrant, according to the UN DESA, the UN Agency for Economic and Social Affairs? How long should you be away from home to be considered a migrant? You can just chime in the chat. Feel free to unmute as well. But if there's no idea, that's also super fine. So, yes, so Saiful, thank you for your contribution. Someone said here, moves away from their usual place of residence. So that is what is very important. Usual place of residence, so your habitual place of residence, and you're currently living in another location. For the IOM, they distinguish between international and internal migration. And so one involves crossing borders, national borders of a country. And we have some guesses here on how long it takes. 12 months is correct. So for the UNDESA, it's at least 12 months in order to be considered a migrant. And so that exchange year that you took for 9 months in one country, you weren't. Under this, you are not considered a migrant. For some other agencies, however, and for other bodies, and of course in academia, they would argue that's not true. For some countries, 6 months is enough for you to be considered a migrant. Thank you, Alima. Thank you, Musa, also, and Vincent, and everybody for joining in. But yeah, so migrant, someone who has a lived experience of migration, correct? All right. Now that we have everything that we need to understand global migration governance, let's look at the actual definitions. Next slide, please. So, according to, there are two kind of lines of how we can understand global migration governance, but I argue that they are more or less the same. Global migration governance is a concept that has developed throughout the years, not only in policy debates, but also in academic debates, in research. So here I take two examples of really good definitions, and I use the colors to show that they are more or less the same. So the IOM, or the International Organization for Migration, which as we know since 2016 is the UN Migration Agency, the IOM states that global migration governance involves the combined frameworks of legal norms, laws and regulations, policies and traditions, as well as organizational structures, and the relevant processes that shape and regulate states' approaches with regard to migration in all its forms, addressing the rights and responsibilities and promoting international cooperation. So it's a very loaded description, as we can see. But if we look at Picou, 2023, Antoine Picou is a university professor at my university, and he has been exploring the role of IOM and migration governance in general. And he defines global migration governance as the normative search for mechanisms that should be put into place to govern migration on the assumption that migration is not adequately governed. And that's why I was asking earlier, why do we have to distinguish between governments and governance? So again, if we look here, mechanisms is another word for the frameworks, the organizational structures, and the relevant processes. Somebody said earlier that it involves the tools, right? The different tools, the instruments. So that's the first part. The second part is it's normative. Normative involves something that has tradition, a little bit of tradition, and it's also something that is not just legal in nature, but is also social in nature. It is what is normalized, correct? So by repeatedly doing something and carrying it out, you normalize it. And so global migration governance is rooted in that. It doesn't exist just out of nowhere. And lastly, the rights and responsibilities. It's based on the assumption that right now, it's an important policy issue. Right now, we have to talk about it and research on it because what we are doing is not enough, because it is not regulated, because it is not safe, because there are people that are involved, there are lives on the line, and so it has to be governed. So at this point, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. If not, I move on to the next slide, the next part, which is concerning the international frameworks, beginning with a global compact for migration. I see going once, going twice. Don't see any raised hands for now. Let's continue to the GCM. Normative, yes. Okay. So Fatuma raised a question, what is normative? Normative is just, it concerns norms. So concerning both social and legal norms. So what is normalized in society. In political sciences as well, the word normative is very loaded because it has a direct relationship to power. It's kind of how something is being exercised repeatedly and normalized in society, but has real, tangible consequences for the different actors. That is what is normative. They use this term a lot, for instance, to describe the power that the European Union holds. It's not something that came up overnight. It's something that since the 1950s and over the years, it has been being built up in order to show that, yes, there's this organization slash union within Europe, and what is normalized there is free mobility, the circulation of goods, the circulation of people, for instance. There you go. I hope that answers your question. As I see no other questions, we move on to the GCM. So, what is the GCM, or the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration? I think the most important thing to remember with regards to the GCM is that it is the first of its kind. It's the first intergovernmental agreement that tries to cover every aspect of migration. And how do they do that? Next slide, please. So, key things to remember for the Global Compact. Let's bring it back a little. In the 1990s, the migration governance was done in a very piecemeal fashion. It was done by different actors that didn't really coordinate with each other. You had the UNHCR that has always been there with regards to addressing refugee issues. You had the ILO that there was a lot of lack of trust within the ILO at the time. And then you have, or the International Labor Organization, sorry. And then you also had the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which at the time was not yet considered a UN agency. It was not under the UN system, and so it was providing mostly logistic services for states. And because of that, migration governance was not really looked at in a global migration governance sense. But it doesn't mean that it didn't exist, right? And in 2018, 164 states came together and agreed that this is, in fact, a global issue. This needs to be discussed in different dimensions, and it needs to be done under a multilateral system within, and so it has to be negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations. And because of that, they came up with 23 objectives for state action. Those are the dimensions of international migration and global migration that needs to be covered. And those 23 objectives are grounded in the UN's SDGs because it's within the UN system. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. It is also grounded in international human rights law. Someone said earlier, rights-based approaches, and so the GCM is exactly that, because you want migration to be safe, orderly, and dignified. And its implementation is supported by the UNNM, or the UN Network on Migration, which convenes every now and then. In French, this is, you might not hear UNNM a lot, you might hear le réseau, so the network, and that is the UN Network on Migration. And the very, very key thing about the GCM that I would say distinguishes it from the GFMD is that it has a very strong regional component. So within those regions, so we have Europe, SWANA, so we have the Asia Pacific as well. There are certain UN agencies that act as coordinating bodies for facilitating these regional reviews. So after the national level consultations on the GCM, it gets escalated and brought to regional reviews. And all of those regional reviews culminate into the progress being reviewed at the what is called the IMRF, or the International Migration Review Forum. Please remember this because this is happening in 2026. The IMRF only happens every 4 years to give states adequate time to implement whatever needs to be implemented to achieve those objectives, but it only happens every 4 years. And the next one is happening in 2026. Next slide, please. So these are the objectives of the Global Compact for Migration. And I don't know if you recognize even the format. It looks very similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. So The GCM objectives includes it's very comprehensive. It goes from data to saving lives, but it also covers labor migration. We have here remittances, sending money from being abroad to your home country. You have here social protection, consular protection. I see the questions and I'll be answering them later in the interest of time, but I see you. Thank you for your active participation. We move on next now to the GFMD, or the Global Forum on Migration and Development. So if the GCM, is under the auspices of the United Nations, the GFMD is not. That is the most important thing to remember. However, it traces its roots in the United Nations system. How did this happen? So, within the UN system, there were these high-level dialogues, these HDLs. And in one of the high-level dialogues on migration, which is a policy issue, of course, for the United Nations, there was, under the leadership of the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, this push to have a consultative mechanism for states and other actors to discuss um, global migration, but specifically its connection to development. This was in the early 2000s, where there was a general trend within policy debates and also in academia to study labor migration because they were starting to realize that these remittances, they were forming a 1 billion-dollar economy, and certain states, for instance, India and the Philippines, were heavily reliant on remittances, on sending money back to your home countries. And so there was now this question to understand how does labor migration, in the sense, the movement of people, facilitate the development of countries where they are from, but also host societies. So how does migration contribute to development? Next slide, please. And so from that, the GFMD, or the Global Forum on Migration and Development, was formed. So if you think about it, the GFMD is older than the GCM. However, it was comprised of first 140 states. There are 26 governments that comprise the steering group, so kind of the main states, or the most active states, if you will, in the GFMD process. And they are also those that have been historically chairs or members of the Troika. Like I said, the GFMD is very multi-stakeholder. It has member states participating. Of course, it is still a state-led process, but it has international organizations within the UN system as observers, and it has the three mechanisms and the youth stakeholder group. I will show you later what that looks like, but what you have to remember is that the GFMD is multi-stakeholder, and it contributes to the UN in other ways. First, what you need to know is the GFMD is administratively handled by the IOM. So, in an administrative capacity, the IOM Secretariat helps facilitate the GFMD. They take care, of course, of logistics. They coordinate with the government that presides over the GFMD every year. Um, and they also make sure that the stakeholders and the meetings between stakeholders are being carried out in an orderly fashion. I'm simplifying, but they they help the GFMD in an administrative capacity. And it contributes to the UN how? First, every year there is a report that is prepared from the GFMD in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, because there is a very strong development component within the GFMD that is not necessarily present within the GCM. It could be, but this one is really the strong link between migration and development. And so from that report, they submit that each year to different fora, notably through the Secretary General at the high level political forum, which happened just last week in New York. Another way that they contribute to the UN is through submissions of the chair, of the GFMD
Contribution
itself,
du
submit
président du
to the
Forum
UN. So if here
mondial sur
there is
l'immigration et le
one chair,
développement
one
lui-même,
government that
chaque année,
presides
il y
over
a
the
un
GFMD,
gouvernement,
they
une
they
présidence,
basically produce a
et
report
cette
based on
présidence
their
produit un
submission to the
rapport
GFMD,
Et des recommandations sont soumises aux Nations Unies, par exemple. Il y a d'autres.
Through the GFMD. Next slide, please.
Sorry, just before we move, Francesca, I see there
Yes.
is a message in the chat. They mentioned grounded
Yes.
HRL.
Oh, yes, very good question. So, grounded in international human rights law. Sorry. So, IHRL, basically it's rights-based. It's another way of saying that the framework is rights-based. I hope that's clear. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for that question. And so this is what the GFMD chairmanship and governance of the GFMD looks like. So in the middle, we have the chair. That's one government each year. This year it's Colombia. Last year it was France. Underneath the GFMD chair, we have the coordinating body. As we said, it was IOM in an administrative capacity as the secretariat of the GFMD. On the right, we have more or less states. The Troika is consisted of the last two presidents plus the current president of the GFMD, current chair of the GFMD. You have the steering group, the 26 member states that are more or less the most active in the GFMD. And you have the Friends of the Forum. It's the 26 states, so the steering group plus all the other member states are active. Then you have the working groups. But on the left, we have the different mechanisms. In addition to the states, we have the mechanisms, civil society, business, and mayor's mechanisms. So civil society is just the different civil society organizations. Businesses, it's a global conglomerate of employers as well as employing entrepreneurs, startups. So that's the business mechanism. So that contribute also to migration because they employ migrants themselves. And then we have the mayor's mechanism, which is a conglomerate of different governments, local and regional governments, mayors that come together within the GFMD to also discuss how migration and development is not only a national or international issue, but it starts at states. Like, how do cities react to migration? And on the leftmost side is MyCP. We are the official youth stakeholder network, facilitating the participation of young people within the GFMD. And the reason we are not called a mechanism is because, one, we do not have a secretariat. We work on a remote basis. And two, we do not have kind of institutional money that allows us to work within the GFMD. Like, we work mostly on a voluntary basis, and we are also a self-organized space for young people to contribute to the GFMD. And so we are here, but we work together with the three other mechanisms on the GFMD. Next slide, please. I see your questions. Thank you, Pierre, for that question. I will respond very quickly. So now the last kind of part of my presentation before we go to review and onward resources is what about the youth? So I gave you a little sneak peek of what what role the youth might play within the GFMD, but not in the GCM. So let's begin with the GCM. So earlier today, I told you how GCM begins at the state level, and then it gets escalated to the regional reviews, and then it gets escalated into what we call the International Migration Review Forum happening in 2026, or the IMRF. So MyCP coordinates youth activities and inputs in all GCM processes, starting with the GCM National Youth Consultations, which again gets escalated to the regional youth consultations. And then all of those inputs are published in a policy review and also in regional input documents. So for each region, there is one policy paper that is produced. And we bring those to the IMRF next year. Super happy to share that this year we collected over 800 voices, so 800 youth individually consulted through the participation of our 65 partner organizations working for, by, and with youth. And they identified 11 priorities within the GCM objectives. So out of 23, 11 were identified as youth priorities this year in preparation for the second International Migration Review Forum. This is the GCM side. How is the GFMD side of things? Perhaps some of you may know MyCP's work through what we were promoting shortly, which was the Migration Youth Forum. So the Migration Youth Forum is actually the preparatory day for young people to participate as delegates in the GFMD. So since 2017, my CP has been coordinating youth participation at the GFMD, and we are now on our fifth Migration Youth Forum. This is kind of to prepare young people to participate in the GFMD because it involves negotiating with states, knowing a lot of jargon within the GFMD, and also self-organizing spaces within what is traditionally designed for states. This year, we also have the third edition, my apologies, of the Youth Leadership and Innovation Award. It is a pitch contest of different activities and initiatives that are carried out by young people in relation to the GFMD themes. And the 6 finalists also participate at the GFMD, pitch their ideas. 3 winners are awarded seed money and mentoring as well to escalate their projects, to scale up their projects. So, for example, if they are implementing it at a local level, they might want to implement it within 2 cities. And so, if they win, they can use the seed money for that. And we also have the different spaces aside from that youth participates in. So aside from youth being there at the table with governments, we also have the youth networking space. It is a speed networking space for young people to connect directly to governments, to speak to them, to talk to them about what is working for them, what is not working, to learn about their initiatives, to learn best practices, etc. So that's the GFMD. GCM, National Regional IMRF, GFMD, more of preparatory meetings, and then one big forum with the Migration Youth Forum as the preparatory day. Next slide, please. So I leave this to you as kind of homework, if you can. Try to remember what these key acronyms mean to test yourself. What do they stand for? They're the most important, I would say, from the presentation. And try to compare and contrast the GFMD. For instance, GFMD and GCM. For instance, you can put GCM under the UN auspices. GFMD contributes to the UN in other ways. But, for example, GCM and GFMD both are international global governance of migration frameworks, for instance. But I leave that up to you. Now I open the floor to the questions. I see that there are already some in the chat, but thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I hope that this was clear. And before I end, lastly, I left you a couple of resources for further reading if you are interested. These resources are available. And also, next slide, please, I added the different, so if you click under youth and the GFMD process as well as youth and the GFMD process, you have the outputs that we produced from MyCP so that you can see how MyCP facilitates, like in real time, the inclusion and meaningful participation of youth in these spaces. So all the policy reports are also there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for this great presentation. And yeah, everyone, as she mentioned, the floor is now open. Please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. But I do know that there were some other questions already in the chat previously. So maybe I'll just read them to you, Francesca. So from Emilio, he asked, so how do the 23 objectives of the GCM connect with the Sustainable Development Goals? And are there any indicators being used to track progress?
So that's a really awesome question, Emilio, and very relevant actually. So yes, there is this handout that is produced by the UN Network on Migration, which I will send right now in the chat and reply directly there. This is a handout of the mapping of each objective of the GCM and which SDGs it directly relates to. So because the GCM is negotiated under the auspices of the UN system, it is very, very directly linked to the SDGs and everything UN. So if you see, for instance, if you look at the first objective, you have data. Data relates directly to SDG goal 10, reduced inequalities, and it also relates directly to SDG goal 17. For instance, partnerships for the goals. SDG 2, which is minimize adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to migrate. It says there that all SDGs are covered within GCM Objective 2 and on and so forth. So I would really encourage everyone to have a look at the handbook if you have time. It's really good. And are there any indicators being used to track progress? Yes. So under each GCM objective, they do have a more comprehensive set of kind of how to evaluate for states if this GCM objective is being achieved. And because of that, another kind of, if you want to respond to your homework, I'm telling you now one of the answers. One of the key differences of the GCM and the GFMD is that there is kind of an evaluative mechanism for the GCM, whereas the GFMD doesn't really evaluate. There's no, it, there is an evaluative mechanism for how the process went, but as for the objectives of the GFMD. There's no like we have to meet these objectives and then we evaluate the progress on those objectives. It doesn't have this type of evaluative mechanism. That is one key difference between the two.
Thank and just
Thank you.
moving on, I just wanted to flag to everyone that right now in the chat, I've sent the attendance form. So please, please, please make sure to fill it in. It's going to be open until the end of the session. So yeah, we know who we can give the certificates at the end. Reminder, if you attend 2 out of 3, so please just make sure you check in. And I wanted to flag there was another question from Pierre on the chat. I'm going to read it out loud for you. So thank you for this exceptional presentation. My question is, how can we normalize the issue of immigration, especially in Africa? Quite a big question.
Wonderful and very good question. I think that this is exactly the type of space to bring it up, right? Because right now, I think one really good avenue for that are the regional level GCM reviews within Africa. It's something that has gained momentum in the recent years and has also been tried to be connected to other fora and other processes in global migration governance. As well as not directly linked to global migration governance, but just international frameworks in general that are happening in the African region. So I would say that because there is a strong regional component to the GCM space is exactly the place for that. I also think that within Africa, at least from my observations, the different civil society organizations are some of the most active actors within the region. And so the civil society definitely play a big role. And many of us youth are part of civil society. We are part of that stakeholder group. Not exclusively, but we wear that hat. And so I think that the civil society and with youth as a very key link, I think we are really driving momentum and also driving not only normalizing the issue of migration itself, or like discussing it, but also how we frame it, right? Because I think that is like kind of the unique perspective that young people have nowadays. We are able to talk about migration not only in terms of root causes, but we understand that it's not that simple, it's not that straightforward, and that young people are moving for different reasons now. It could be opportunity driven. It could be something that is a very hopeful experience, while still acknowledging that at the end of the day, there are real issues and very real lives on the line that the Mediterranean Sea is more or less a graveyard, right? And so I think those are my three responses to summarize for you. First, the regional component within the GFMD, within the GCM, my apologies, GCM. Second, not only discussing the issue within civil society, which is a very big actor, but also linking it to the other international frameworks that are being discussed in Africa right now. You have, for example, the robot process, Abuja frameworks as well, and other international fora that are not just exclusively linked to migration. And third, the youth being the key link in shaping how we discuss migration and how we frame it to other people.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And I saw that there was someone with a hand up, so maybe to let you go. And then I see all the questions in the chat. Don't worry, we're gonna get to them. But I think that person has raised down their hand. Would you like to still go? I see there is a hand up, but I cannot see who it is. Yeah, Rohan,
Hi,
go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you so much, Francisca. It was quite comprehensive, given all the insights that you just shared. I just had a very simple question. Joining in from India and having extensively worked with the grassroots, I really want to know how can we better integrate the grassroots data and lived migrant experiences into these global migration frameworks so that the policies aren't just technically sound, but they're also morally grounded and locally legitimate. And as we know that the GCM calls for evidence-based migration policies and even the GFMD promotes multi-stakeholder cooperation as mentioned by you before. So how can we essentially deeply entrench the realities of the grassroots as well? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rohan, and I'm glad to see that you're participating from India. Um, Wanted to give also like a very good shout out to India because at least for the grassroots and civil society movements within this country, they're actually very strong, and that is despite the kind of structural constraints that they face within a region that is not necessarily always the friendliest to grassroots movements. I hear what you say. How do we integrate the grassroots level findings and narratives to this high level? And that's why I think that's where the multi-stakeholder design comes to place. So the first is you have a specific mechanism called the GFMD civil society mechanism that facilitates the participation of grassroots leaders and civil society organizations and representatives to the actual GFMD summit, which is happening very soon in September. And so, because they are in the key spaces, they can directly discuss with member states and governments and also bring those interventions to the floor. So they are very much on the record and this consultative process. Of course, that is really one of the best ways, I would say, when you have a mandate that allows you to be in these spaces and you have a dedicated space for you. However, I am very much aware that in the last few years, we see the shrinking, right, of the civil society space. That is something that we see all across the board, not only within the GFMD, but also within the UN system at large. And so that is a very, very real problem. And so when we have this issue, how do we then bring up the voices from the grassroots, right? There are some work that is being done, for instance, within the framework of the GFMD, but also within the framework of, for example, last year, the recent HLPF. Civil society, one of the things they're really good at doing is organizing, self-organizing, right? Unfortunately, it's something that comes out more out of need than out of choice. And because of that, there are some parallel side events or fora that are happening that are specific to grassroots movements, but also just within these spaces. I think that being able to bring that to the actual place, even though it is not necessarily in the same auditorium or in the same halls where the governments are, being there in this space gives them the political leverage to bring it as a bigger issue because it's a question of visibility too. So I think that for now, that's how I would say we are contributing to bringing and leveraging those voices. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure if I answered the second question as well, so could you just please remind me really quickly?
No, it essentially was the same thing that bridging the realities between of the grassroots and these global policy making mechanisms. And yeah, essentially the multi-stakeholder cooperation, that's the one instrument that we can capitalize on. But given like the international community is heading towards a more isolationist pursuit of global conduct, we have nations pulling out of these international frameworks. It might sound a bit um, it might sound a bit tough cooperating in these multilateral spaces, but yeah, definitely answer my question. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Rohan. And I think that also links to another question that I see here that I was really excited to answer actually. And I think if that's okay, Stephanie, I'll jump right next to that. Alima here asked that considering the UN 80 reforms and ongoing funding cuts that affected all UN agencies, including IOM, how do you think GCM is going to be affected? Am I already seeing the negative effects of the funding cuts? So for everyone's information, for those who are unfamiliar, we have the UN 80, which is, we are approaching this. It was at the initiative of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And essentially, what we're seeing is not only are the stakes of reform within the UN system happening, but we are also looking at the very future of the United Nations. It is bringing forward the question of, is multilateralism still the best way to go forward in addressing the different challenges of the global world order that we have today? And so within IOM, right? Yes, I of course I'm seeing how they are restructuring and also how that is affecting their work. Specifically, for instance, right now within the IOM system, the former youth department has been absorbed under the migrant engagement department. So it's not just now they don't have like something that is specific to youth. They have it kind of, I wouldn't say lumped together, but kind of together with other engagement with other stakeholders, including civil society, for instance, including indigenous peoples, etc. And so because of that, there is a very clear restructuring, right? And so their strategy, their youth strategy is also very different now. It's together with the other actors. I think at least for young people, it could have, it's two things, right? On the one hand, it makes you ask what is really essential in having an effective system. Do we really need a youth department in order to talk about youth within migration spaces and to facilitate the participation of youth? At the same time, you also put into the, like, that's one side, right? Maybe we don't need a youth department. Maybe this is really the most effective way to discuss um, youth priorities within the framework of the GCM and the GFMD. But on the other side, you also have the question of with this, there is less visibility for youth. Also, youth are being um, put together with civil society. We know for a fact that youth are not just civil society, we're cross sectoral. Some youth represent local government, some are young diplomats, some are juggling multiple hats. And so, in the middle ground there, I think I think that the fight doesn't stop, right? Because similar to the first question with civil society, one thing the youth is always good at is self-organizing. And still, with everything that's happening to UN 80, the funding cuts, people are unfortunately losing their jobs. Maybe we are graduating into a new system that for now it sucks. It's very difficult to manage. It's reform, it's structural reform, but maybe it actually makes sense in the medium term or in the long term. I think that's how I would state this. And as a like kind of tiny addition into that, or food for thought for you, I know that the GCM is not graduating soon. It's something that's still relevant. We have the IMRF in 2026. But for example, for the GFMD, something that is being asked is, what is the future of the GFMD like? That's something that we are going to be discussing in a meeting on August 5th. And so is the GFMD still going to be the same process and this look the same as it is, or is there a need to simplify it? Is there so much fatigue within the system that there is a need to simplify the process and thereby change the mechanism that is happening in line with the UN80? I don't know the answer. We will see in the next few months. But yes. And alternative. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just saw that question as well in the chat, and another one. And I think, unfortunately, those are the last two because we're running a little bit out of time. Apologies about that. But yeah, I see you already saw the question. So, what possible alternative funding sources can the GCM leverage to cover the financing gaps for future programming from the UO?
It's also a super good question. I think that financing is a very, very, very relevant question. And so Stephanie and other MyCP delegates just recently attended the Financing for Development that happened in Seville a couple of weeks ago. And I saw that even when I attended the high-level political forum in New York last week, there was a question of bringing to question why are people in migration at a financing for development forum? Why are they bringing migration as a policy issue here? So the very relevance of migration as a policy issue being brought to question, but the answer is very obvious, right? So I think that not just the GCM, but in general, migration can leverage these spaces to respond to those financing gaps. Unfortunately, it requires a lot more creativity, and also kind of aligning with whatever is unfortunately trendy right now, like reframing why this is important. So, for example, I would say that in the last recent years, anything that is data driven, that is something that is more likely to receive funding than something that is more qualitative in nature. That is just like the trend in the development sector in the last few years. And so evidence-based migration policy, data-driven migration policy projects are kind of receiving that attention and by extension receiving the financing. And it's a tough time. It requires all the creative juices, and I think that cuts across everybody that is working in these international migration framework spaces right now.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And if I'm not wrong, the last question is from Fatuma, who asked how effective is the GCM, I think she meant, in addressing protected refugee situations like the Dahab, where refugees stayed for over 30 years.
Thanks, Fatima. So, Fatima, I think it's a good question. So, how effective is the GCM? Um, every year they don't evaluate all 23 objectives at the IMRF, right? They pick very specific objectives, not only at the regional level, but also at the international level that are priorities for that year. And so if you look at certain objectives, you have there some more or less those that are relevant to the situation. For example, dignified movement, for instance. And so when you check those evaluative, like what are the features of this, and you see the situation, right? You'll see that, oh, okay, the GCM needs to work more. The states need to work more into implementing this objective because, as we can see from this situation, it's not that effective. Again, that is, I think, the beauty of the GCM. It has an evaluative component to it that the GFMD doesn't necessarily have. Of course, because of that, it's a different process. It's more rigorous, it's more evaluative, it checks, has this been reached, has this not been reached, etc. So that's how it addresses it. Now, how effective it is another question because you're asking, right? Once this is evaluated, do they go back and do they actually address what needs to be done? Now, that is a question of political will. That is a question of financing. And unfortunately, right, we know that it might not be perfect on the ground and the implementation and the review. But I think that's why we still need to continue having these processes, and that's why these processes are still relevant. Is there a need perhaps to simplify or to change certain things to make it more effective? Absolutely. But are they important? Do they have to stay? I think they should.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions, but I will be following up with the slides where you also have Francesca's email. So if you do have any questions, yeah, we're happy to reply to them later on. And then, yeah, just to close off. So apologies, we're running over 1 or 2 minutes. If you need to leave, please make sure that you've signed the attendance form that I've sent in the chat before that. So yeah, this was the fourth session of our capacity building series that, again, I remind you, it's running until the end of the year. The sessions are now bi-monthly, taking place twice in the same day for more accessibility. And French interpretation will also be available for the whole session, both times of the day. And the recordings and the materials, as I mentioned, will always be shared with you after. And stay tuned for more updates about the continuation of the series. MYCP's social media is a great place to know about when we're having the next one, which is going to be in September. But here you have our website as well that you're welcome to scan. And if you have any doubts about the capacity building session, or you would like to keep in touch, please do write to us or to me. And you have my email over there as well. And please do follow MYCP on social media or visit our website. So yeah, without further ado, thank you so much, everyone. Extra thanks to Francesca for the amazing session and for everyone here for attending. Last reminder, please do sign the attendance form, and we look forward to seeing you in our next session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.